This panel session is on the question of, is Australia ready for a repairability star rating? Essentially, this panel discussion will consider the role of product labelling in helping consumers to make informed choices when purchasing products such as domestic appliances, laptops and smartphones. We've heard about the French Repairability Index this morning. What lessons can we take? And what would be the policy process towards making such a repairability star rating here a reality? I'll hand over to John so that he can introduce his panellists. Thank you. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Leanne. If I could ask the panellists to come down and join me, Tabor, Kate, Matthew, that would be great. Come and get yourselves comfy. Any chair, any seat, take a pick. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country, including the Ngunnawal people and the Tongarong and Jaitmathang people of in my home region of the Victorian Alps, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Labelling. Some of you, many of you, might be very familiar with what was recommended in the Productivity Commission report from October last year, but I'm going to jump straight into some of this for those that aren't familiar, but also to just remind you of some of the specifics and the language used by the Productivity Commission in their work, in their mammoth landmark document, and in particular the finding where they do talk about better consumer information leading to more repairable, more durable products. And they state that labelling is likely to help address information gaps around repairability and durability. This can assist consumers to purchase more repairable and or durable products that align with their preferences and encourage manufacturers to develop these types of products. So an interesting point there, the specifics around how the Commission has talked about this issue, and right down to the very specific recommendations that they put forward, and that is looking to the relevant agencies to commit to introducing a labelling scheme within a certain period of time, establish working groups to ensure effective consultation and engagement and steer the development of such a program, and make sure that the consultation is inclusive and, again, courteous and respectful. Look at the role and value of trials and pilots in this regard, to look at how it might focus in on particular product types or classifications, and also to review that, to look at what can be learned out of a pilot or a trial. So there's some very specific things there that came out of the Productivity Commission that are important for us to remind ourselves that this is not just a whim, a general desire. It's a result of the submissions that came in, those for, those against, those indifferent, around the question of consumer labelling and how that might help improve rates of repair. So I thought that was worth sharing with you around what the Productivity Commission has said to date or in their report. What I wouldn't mind doing now is we're going to kick into shortly a pre-recorded presentation from Jean-Paul Ventier, now retired but a former government official with the French Environment Ministry, was one of the architects of the French Index for Repairability, and Jean-Paul's going to give us a sense of some of the work that he did, some of the learnings, etc. And then we'll go into some short snapshots from each of our panellists, from Kate Harris, Tabor Ackman and Matthew Steen, with their perspectives around labelling, both at a general level, but also drilling down a bit more around the role and value relevance of labelling for repairability. So, Brian, Adam, if we can go to Jean-Paul's pre-record, that would be great.
Hi everyone, my name is Jean-Paul Ventier. I've been working in the French Ministry of Ecology. Now I'm retired from the ministry, but still active as an independent expert. So I'm very glad to share this presentation with you, and special thanks for John, who gives me this opportunity. This is the content. I will skip the part which is written in green, so as to remain within 10 minutes. But if you come back later, you will be able to see the entirety of the scoring system. So at the origin, there were many discussions with stakeholders organized by the French Ministry of Ecology. And the idea came out about circular economy to introduce a mandatory repair index. Mandatory, that makes it different from voluntary. So the law is called AGEC. It's about circular economy. There are in the Article 16, the Article 16 introduces the repairability index with obligations for the producers to calculate and to communicate the index to the retailers and for the retailers to inform the consumer. These are the first 5 categories on the left. They are in force since January the 1st, 2021. On the right side, the 4 next categories, the criteria have been published and it will enter into force in November. Below, you have the logo. So it's a score out of 10, maximum is 10, and the color is changing every 2 points. Here are the criteria. So it was the first time in the world such an index was introduced, so we decided to have a balanced approach. There are 5 criteria with equal weight. The availability of the technical documentation, the ease of disassembly, the availability of spare parts, the price of spare parts, which is original. For example, the European Commission has decided not to take the price into account and specific criteria. The criteria are published in the Journal Officiel. This is an example for smartphones. It gives you the weighting factor of each sub-criterion here. So for example, you see that for criteria number 2, disassembly, tools and fasteners are taken into account. So we make an addition of points towards 100 and it's divided at the end by 10. Here, I will not comment it. I will just go very quickly. But you can see in the next slide the entirety of the scoring system. It's a matrix. You have columns, you have lines, and according to the answers, you get so many points. Here, you have 6 points if you make the promise to keep the documentation available for 6 years. So I'm not commenting except to say that it is there are tangible criteria, verifiable, and they give a general view. Here the delivery time, the speed of the delivery time in days for each spare part. Now here, I will comment it. This is original, but it's considered as a very important criteria to facilitate, in order to facilitate repairing. So it's a ratio. You have the price of spare parts divided by the price of the equipment. I continue with specific criteria. And we come to an end. So the results, after 6 months, you had a different average in each category. Lawnmowers were the best, and at that time, TVs were the worst. Also, you can discriminate according to trademarks. still after 6 months. And after 1 year, this gives you an idea of the distribution you have for each category, the average, the minimum, maximum. You see that if you're interested in star scoring or with letters, A, B, C, D, E, this gives you an idea. The consumers, they knew about the index after 6 months. They understood that the intention is to be an incentive for manufacturers. And these are the conclusions. So the producers have been working hard to comply with the regulation. The retailers put pressure on producers and develop new services, selling spare parts, have videos to explain how to self-repair, repair by yourself. The repair activities have been increasing. The consumer, we have seen that they understand, and NGOs, they took an interesting initiative. They decided to make a coalition in order to challenge the scores calculated by producers. So the teachings, this is what I have learned. This is what is important for success. Of course, the scoring system should be discriminating. If it's too easy, the criticism will be severe. And of course, these are the most relevant criteria: ease of disassembly, availability, and price for each spare part. So it means that documentation is not considered now as such an important criteria. And also the so-called specific criteria is not so important. There have been complaints that it's not completely transparent. Some results should be made public, but not all. So you should have an eye on that. It should bring complete transparency. And of course, the method should be universal. That is, having only one method, explaining how to adapt it to a new product category. This is to save time, because there was much tension in the groups, the general group and the groups by categories, so there is no need to do again and again the same discussions. These are the sources. You can find documents on the website of the ministry in French and in English, and this is a detailed report where you can find the data after 1 year. Thank you for your attention and have a good discussion. Bye-bye.
Jean-Paul may be online and listening, but I'm not sure. He may pose some questions and comments through Slido. But I must say he's been very generous with his time, both with the Repair Network and eWaste Watch and other organisations over the last 12 months, and will be a good resource for us. He's very frank and direct about what has worked and what hasn't worked in France, and in particular how to undertake more effective stakeholder engagement with producers and NGOs and research institutions and the like. So we look forward to continuing to work with Jean-Paul. What we'll do now is I'll introduce Kate Harris from the Global Eco Labelling Initiative to come and give us a snapshot of how you see labelling, its role and value, given your particular history and involvement as a CEO, former CEO of the Good Environmental Choice Australia, and your current work. So some snapshots now from each of our panellists. So you're welcome to come up here and whisper into the microphone.
Thanks for having me, and thanks, John. And it's exciting to see conferences like this and having an important conversation. I too would just like to acknowledge that we're on Ngunnawal land and pay my respects. I guess a bit of context. So Secretariat of the Global Eco-Labelling Network, and have worked in eco-labelling in the sense of ISO 14024. So I'm also chair of the Australian Committee for the ISO 14020 groups and on the International Working Group. So good to know that these, the environmental labelling suite of international standards are on the move and changing and updating. So good to stay in the loop. So a little bit about Global Eco-Labelling Network and what we do. So we don't write standards usually ourselves, and members do. And we have 37 members around the world who are doing full life cycle eco-labels on products and services, very much looking at the Sustainable Development Goal 12 and responsible consumption. To answer the question of whether Australia need one, well, if not now, then when is what I would say. And certainly I think we're seeing a lot of tensions and challenges that lead to a need for sustainable solutions in a scalable manner. And so again, it's really exciting to see. From Jen's perspective and the true sense of the word eco-labelling, and really admire what the work's been done in France. I've been working with similar labels that have been, I guess, continued that scheme. Some additional criteria I would encourage to look at. So repairability would certainly be key. And it's also considerations such as that take back. So John and I were just commenting on that too. How does it actually get back to that repair, and heard about the medical technology too. But also fit for purpose. You know, does it do its job well as doing it for a long time? Is it easy to get it back to the manufacturer that we've heard? Does it also consider things like energy use and some of those other essential issues? I'd also highlight that, certainly from my experience of when I was CEO at GECA, is the challenge around materiality and the health of materials. And I can say that I've seen lots of factories with people with a very limited time span, sometimes 5 years of life, who are making a product or even repairing and take back. And we've seen some of those horrible images with things like e-waste. And I really would also like to bring the human element to this as well. This is critical when we're looking at the circular economy solutions. What are we making with? How are we designing it with the end in mind, as well as the people who are actually doing the repairability? So I think that's something critical too. Labelling really does help these solutions. Eco-labelling and its true sense of the word, I highly encourage, as long as it has truth, trust and transparency. So that is all about the actual quality of the eco-labelling. And so transparency is key to know what sits behind the label. So how do you find that information? How was the standard developed? And then in regards to the verification of that information, how do we know that's true? And unfortunately, we're at a point with greenwash and a significant amount of people throwing labels everywhere, including first-party and second-party labels. So having that sense of a trusted body who is independent and without bias to ensure there is a third-party assessment and certification of that decision is also really critical. So yes, work with stakeholders, yes, work with the manufacturers, the distributors, the key stakeholders, policymakers, but indeed we really do need to look at having that third-party critical element and have transparency around it. So again, I really encourage when we're looking at indices or labelling and procurement decisions to really seek that truth, trust and transparency. And lastly, because I know I've only got 5 minutes, I'm probably already done my 5 minutes, is look really just in terms of how do we make this happen? And we do need to make it happen. The how, my experience would say, work with the manufacturers, but we need large business and government procurement. So we're talking about sustainable procurement solutions. And certainly there's a lot happening. I do a lot of training with World Bank and ILO across that large impact, particularly the infrastructure space, but beyond. So where do we need to start? How can we make the biggest difference with truth, trust and transparency? But also ask and they shall come. The biggest reticence I see is to say, the products, they're not there. the certified products, the eco-label products, it's not there. Therefore, we have permission to go for the lowest common denominator. And you can see from China, Japan, many countries, the Nordic countries, who are many of our GEN members, who actually in working in partnership with government, with business, with manufacturers, and being really clear on what good looks like, the market does move. It moves significantly, and impact follows, which is for the betterment of all of us. So that's me. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. A good overview in that sense. Matthew Steen from Choice. Matthew's the Director of Review and Testing with Choice, and will introduce himself in a bit more detail, but give us a sense of where Choice is at on issues of sustainability, product sustainability broadly, but labelling as well.
It's really hard to go after Jean-Pierre because I feel like I'm in a bit of hero worship right now. So I don't know how many people here know Choice. It's the Australian Consumers Association, started in 1959 by Ruby Hutchison, who was the first female senator in WA. I always like mentioning that because I feel like it was like we were starting off in the right space at the right time. And I'm always very enthusiastic about working at Choice. So sustainability is, so we poll our members every year. We send them surveys, we find out what they want because we're a consumer organisation. And we can track those trends over time. We have 200,000 members, excuse me. So we see sustainability becoming more and more important over time. So we've had to, as a consumer organisation, you react to that change in trends. So we need to become relevant for our consumers. So we need to change Choice, which has been very performance oriented, to become more sustainable oriented. In short, we react to how people need us to be. But durability has been since 1959 when we started. Everyone wants to know how long this product is going to last. Is it very reliable? And we ask that. We've only been really able to ask that through surveys. How soon does something actually break down? And we've been doing that for about 30 years, which gives us a really good depth of data. And any subscribers here, I encourage you to look out for September Mag, because we actually go into 10 years of data across that for all you data nerds. So we're looking at how we can pivot into giving a more accurate representation of that length of time. Because if you look at things like LCA, or life cycle analysis, and embedded carbon, that makes a big difference over the time that something lasts. So if you've got a washing machine that lasts 12 years versus a washing machine that lasts 18 years, the embedded carbon produced over that period of time is ameliorated if it's a longer lasting washing machine. So that's really important for us to focus on as well. But getting the data around how long that thing lasts is really hard. But it's out there. Sometimes manufacturers are really interested in actually bringing that forward. Most times they're not, because there's an amount of ACL awareness that they have around if you say something is going to last this long, then they're going to say, well, every time someone comes to them after, before an 18-year period, they're going to have to actually say, oh yeah, we did say that, so we're going to have to pay for that repair. And that's not as interesting to some manufacturers. But we're looking at where we can actually fill the need inside of a whole list of requirements. Someone actually showed don't know if Julie Bolton's here today, but she showed a list of R values, and I don't have all of them here, but things like product design, product use, durability without the need for repair, only maintenance, repairability, reuse, recycling. We've been looking at all of those to see what consumers are actually interested in. And obviously there's a level at which consumers are interested in, and then there's the next level of what they should be interested in, because sometimes you only see one thing because you don't have the whole picture in front of you, and that's our job, is to show the whole picture. So my next thing was actually pointing out the French Reliability Index is actually a great baseline. And I think we should actually have a look at it really closely and use it as something, as I said, a baseline, and then work on top of it. So a lot of the time we look at what the EU does and we think that's fantastic, I wish we were doing that here. And that's true in lots of cases, but we should think of it as that's the base of what we should be working on. And then we should build on top of that. We're cognizant of the fact that we can't do it alone. It needs a whole bunch of manufacturers, it needs consumers, it needs government, it needs a whole network of people to actually come on board with this, which we're kind of excited and scared about. And it needs a lot of media too, to get word out there. I was going to say, I was talking to someone earlier about usage phase in the LCA. So I don't know if this is getting too minor or if I've gone over my 5 minutes. So what Choice does when we test most things is we take the standard, the Australian standard or international standard, and then we build on that. So as I said, 200,000 members, we ask them, how do you use your whatever it happens to be? And then we use that data to actually build a methodology on top of the standard. And that's a really useful process for us. And one of the benefits of it is that you can test a usage phase. And if anyone knows anything about LCAs, the usage phase is often the highest part, maybe around 85 to 90%. So you might have 7 or 8%, which is your actual manufacturing. You might have a couple of percent at the end, and the rest is all it's being used by the consumer. That's a really interesting part, and we have some really nice data around that because we actually find out how people use their machines. So we can actually find out how much that usage phase actually uses. So we're looking at actually how we can reflect that, but also we are in the privileged position of having a network of consumer organisations around the world that we lean into quite heavily. And we've contacted a few over the last few weeks. One of them in particular has been doing this work already around repairability, which is Projet Vu in Quebec. And they've been really doing something interesting, taking a lot of that data from the French Repairability Index, but also taking really simple items. So for example, I don't know if anyone's a subscriber to Projet Vu, but if you go to it, you'll see that they focused on barbecues to begin with because you can see how to repair it because everything's exposed. And that makes it really simple to understand, okay, the ignition starter is something that commonly fails, and I can actually replace that. Or it might be a whole bunch of other things that fail, which actually it's only about 3 things that fail within a barbecue. But they've taken that first step of doing a pilot, just as the French did for a couple of different items. So there's different avenues that we can take, and it's really measuring what's the impact of taking those different templates that we could use within Australia, and the advantages that we can basically lean on a lot of the work that's already been done. So we're not starting from scratch. We have a lot of information that we can work with, and I'm not just talking about Choice, I'm talking about everyone in the room and online. And now I'm going over my 5 minutes, so I'm going to stop there. But that is our focus on Choice, which sounds like a lot, and is.
Thanks, Nick. It's an example of one area of input that in the design of an Australian labelling scheme and associated standards for repairability, that the wisdom, the data, the wealth of knowledge within Choice will be essential, alongside, as you say, other players in this space. Next, I'd like to introduce Tabor Ackman from the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. Correct me if I get it wrong. Tabor is the Director of Product Stewardship Schemes and Regulation, deeply involved in product stewardship policy and programs with the Australian Government, including work on the National Television and Computer Recycling Scheme and the ongoing e-stewardship task force that's looking at what are the possible reforms and changes to e-products generally. So, Tabor, thanks for joining us. Over to you.
So thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me today. It was a long walk here from John Gorton Building.
It's not raining.
So as John mentioned, Director of Product Stewardship Schemes and Regulation, but I am also a choice subscriber, so I look forward to seeing the September issue. Or member, I'm not sure what I'm technically, with the paying one, whatever kind that is. So John mentioned the National Television and Computer Recycling Scheme, so I think it's a great starting point for, I think, today, because that's the legislation, the rule was first enacted 11 years ago, officially started recycling a little bit after that, but and its name tells it all. It was the Television and Computer Recycling Scheme, and that was 11 years ago. It's done a really good job. It's collected and recycled over 500,000 tonnes of television and computers since its implementation, all funded by industry, providing free access to recycling to consumers and small businesses. But a lot's happened in the e-product space in the last 11 years and the repair and reuse space in the last 11 years. So just having product stewardship schemes that are purely recycling was a product at the time, and something we're definitely looking at now to provide advice to government on what's product stewardship for 2022, what's repair, what's reuse, what do we think about persistent organic pollutants, what do we think about chemicals concern. We are a little bit limited at the Commonwealth level into what we can and can't regulate, but how do we make sure when we're designing these schemes that we consider these issues and the design and the front part of the product's life cycle as best as we can? Because what we don't want to do is we don't want to have perverse outcomes where things could have a second life, but they're getting diverted to potentially even just shredding and the metals being extracted and the rest. And NTCS has a 90% material recovery rate, which is a positive thing, but it does lead to some landfilling still. So how can we make sure that when we go forward from 2022 that our schemes are as forward-looking as necessary and really take into account repair and reuse? But also at the other time saying, well, what does that mean for our schemes, and what does that mean for national Commonwealth regulated product stewardship? Because I'm also responsible for the product stewardship for oil scheme. And an interesting fact of that scheme is that if you collect waste oil, as JJ Richardson, Ren Oil do, and re-refine that back into a base oil that can go into a car, into a machine, you actually pay the same, not to make it straight, but the excise tariff, not the customs tariff, the same excise tariff rate as somebody who made that from a virgin product. So you're paying the same tax on that because you are making a new product. So as we look at things like reuse, that will have a defined product life. So we don't want to just go, well, you've repaired that once under a Commonwealth scheme, that's it, don't worry about it, and a job done. Because that will have a defined life, and that will still, potentially one day end up as, well, definitely one day will end up as e-waste. So how do we make sure that we deal with and we include repairability and reuse in a way that works, that's effective, but also just doesn't kick things down the road? And one of the most important things we talk about is we don't want to see things that technically, they're still repairable, they've been repaired, they can be reused for 6 or 12 months before they become obsolete. We send them maybe to the Pacific or to Africa, and then they die in 1 or 2 years. But what happens to them then? We don't want to be exporting our problems overseas to other countries. So it's another factor we're really conscious of as well. And also we want to make sure that we're not doing unnecessary regulation. So we want to make sure what we're doing is the best outcome for Australia. So when we look at that, we look at the net benefit that regulation might achieve. And one of the things we always use as a baseline is, well, what are we doing now? And is what we're proposing to do, or one of the series of options proposing to do, have a net benefit to society? And what of all the options, what is the largest net benefit? So that's one of the things we're definitely looking at right now, considering a lot of submissions we received to an e-waste discussion paper that John, the task force that John referred to, did last December. For those who are interested, there's 44 submissions. The non-confidential submissions are available on the DQ website. So if you are curious how to shorten the current department's name, it is very long, it's DQ. So they're available to have a read of as well. So I'm conscious of time, so I might just be very quick now. So final thing, so what we're doing now as a new department is we're doing a lot of background work, and we're going to advise government. So ultimately a decision on what is regulated in the space of repairability or product stewardship or reuse or anything like that, these are decisions of government. So our role as public services to do some work and to advise them on what we think the best options are, but it is a government decision. So I think there's nothing we can tell you, unfortunately, here today about decisions that are upcoming, but it is something we're definitely actively working on. We are providing advice to government on these options, and hopefully in the future there's some more information coming out around kind of directions the Commonwealth's taking and how those new directions may include and kind of recognise repair and reuse. So I'll pause it there. I think we can potentially start answering questions. Thank you.
Leanne, are there any questions on Slido?
There are. Would you you like to?
Feel free to, let me give you a microphone. I think that's all. Try that. Yep, sounds right. Go for it.
Thank you. We do have a few questions. We have a question from Chloe Davison. How can repairability label evolve to consider factors mentioned by Kate, but also avoid the lack of harmonisation seen in recycling labelling globally? For you, Kate, I think.
So I think it's integration. So in terms of the life cycle labels, as I mentioned, we're currently working with some repairability labels, mainly out of France, which I think shows, you sort of set the agenda and things emerge. So in regards to a life cycle eco-label, things like recyclability labels, energy labels, water, repairability, those other components all fit in. So it's actually working and making sure there's testing around that verification, but it is integration of all of those aspects with a credibility to make sure that we can do it all. Because if we're honest, we're at a point where we do need to look at all of these aspects, not just one. And the challenge with that is how do we continue from a consumer and a procurement perspective to continue to ask and expect more. Often quite confusing and dilution happens with single issue labels, self-declared claims, and this is often a play on greenwashing and confusion that makes it really difficult, which is why things like choice are really critically important. Credible eco-labelling is incredibly important because there is actually another fight by others to try and take that away and show that they're best. And I have to say there are some that really care about this in the manufacturing space and there's some who really don't. And so really as consumers and procurers, how do we keep saying yes and what's next? And how can we all work together as an ecosystem, which you also heard about?
Thank you very much. Another question from Paul. Where do you think that mandatory repairability or durability labelling fits within legislation? Oh, it's just skipped. Would it be within the consumer law, for example?
So I'll preface that I'm not a lawyer, but there's a number of options, I think, both within potential legislation administered by the department, but also more broadly, I think ACCC have products like certification mark labelling as well. So there's a number of avenues that could be explored, and it kind of depends on what the labelling is, how widespread it is, what it's trying to say. If it's covered under consumer law, as mentioned before, consumer law can sometimes put people off because of the potential implications of what are viewed as promises by consumers. And I know, for example, also the department also administers the kind of voluntary product stewardship accreditation, so that can cover things like labelling and repairability and reuse schemes to say, look, we've actually tested and had a look at how they do these things, and we're comfortable kind of put the Australian government stamp on that as it's a genuine label with a genuine background. I think that's an option as well. So I think there's no single way forward. I think there's definitely options under both law administered by the ACCC, but also law administered by the department, DQ.
Thank you, Tavor. There's just a tip to the people on Slido. If you are online and you've lost sight and sound, can I suggest that you jump back out of the link and maybe re-enter, because that might fix things. Sorry. A question from Mended Australia. What are the barriers to getting the NTCRS, including reuse and repair of e-products, back into the community? I think that's for you, Tavor.
Yeah, do you want to take it?
You're a popular guy.
So I think one of the things that we're looking at now is that the scheme was designed 11 years ago, and the name says it all, was a recycling scheme. So it's looking at what are the fundamental structural elements of that scheme, and do they need to be changed to allow reuse to recognise this? As I said before, we can't just say you've repaired something, so don't worry about it in the future. We still need to kind of make sure that when it hits end of life, it's being accounted for. And also, we currently say that you can export certain recyclate from the NTCRS overseas, but it has to be recycled in Australia to the relevant 5377 standard. So just making sure what they do for reuse doesn't put people at risk. We don't want people having fires and things like that. So there's a lot of things around safety and quality and kind of structural elements.
Thank you. I might raise a point that was raised last year when we discussed product labelling. This is not from Slido, this is myself. One of the concerns of manufacturers is that, you know, there are global manufacturers, and if every country starts to adopt a different labelling scheme, that's particularly challenging. We have one in France, and Europe is looking at that. Should we not all try to align, perhaps? What would you say to that?
I think that's 100%, I don't disagree with that at all. I think it's a good point. There's always a caveat of we'd have to make sure whatever that looks like works for Australia, and you know, we've got, you know, the legislative kind of heads of power to make that happen, but I think that's a very good point. And I think it's one of the things that before we would do any regulation to cover these things, we would have to do a regulatory impact assessment, and it's 100% one of the things we would look at to that net benefit that I spoke about before, and making sure what we're doing is achieving the outcome we want, but not imposing unnecessarily burden, because we don't want to make things more expensive if there's not going to be a kind of benefit to that.
Leanne, if I may jump in on that one, I think one of the areas that we really shouldn't overlook, and again there are great learnings and there's an existing compliance infrastructure there, is the success of energy ratings in Australia and the star rating system, the water efficiency labelling system. You know, the infrastructure in many respects is there, and we're blessed today to have Ian McAllister, who's the Chief Executive of the Consumer Electronic Suppliers Association. Ian, do you want to comment around harmonisation and also energy ratings and water ratings and how they might be relevant here?
Thanks, John. Yes, CESA, we represent the global suppliers of consumer electronics and home appliances. And a key issue for CESA, and it's the same issue we have in all labelling regulatory arrangements. We are subject, our members are subject to a host of different labels. Some are successful, some are not. But we have the same issues, the common features among the more successful ones, such as the energy efficiency labelling, water efficiency labelling, battery compartment labelling, the ACCC's recent labels, electrical safety, and ACMA, EMC and RADCOM labelling. Those are successful labelling arrangements, and a key thing I'd like to get across is that a feature of those arrangements is they're based on international standards. They pick up international work or international labels. We are only 2% of the global market in Australia, so it's very difficult for us to introduce unique Australian-only labels. It's much more cost-effective to pick up what's happening in larger jurisdictions. So for us, international standards are very important to base, for example, with repairability, to work out the accreditation. How do you assess the French index, for example? That assessment process, very difficult to assess. It's groundbreaking work that the French have done. However, there's few little limitations there. For example, when suppliers in Europe self-declare. Now, not all suppliers and manufacturers are, quite honest. And there's a bit of gaming and cheating taking place already on the French repair index. So it's a difficult one. But on the bright side, the European Parliament have endorsed going forward on all of this, and I imagine that the French arrangements will be subsumed into a broader single European market arrangement in the future. So I'm hopeful, and CESA, we're very happy to participate and make in discussions as a major stakeholder with the department on future directions in labelling. We don't particularly want to move too fast because we don't want to get in front of what's happening in Europe. The United States is a fair way behind in many of these areas, but they are also in certain states catching up. So, yeah.
Ian, the subtext I hear from you is we've got a lot to learn from the success of energy ratings and wells and water.
Terrific model. Both the wells and energy, they are very successful models. Another key factor of those models is they have appropriate compliance and enforcement arrangements. So they are well funded to follow up on the compliance and enforcement. That's another issue that the French have as well,
sure.
to follow up on the declarations made by suppliers. It's difficult.
Kate?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I just wanted to say, you know, where we see standouts and simplification on that global harmonisation is like some of our members like TCO or GEC that focus on a particular product category and then scale internationally. But I will say the challenge and the complexity is also not only keeping that best practice, but also raising the bar. And we do a lot of work with UN Environment in Latin America and Africa, Southeast Asia, and really supporting them. And to your point, having just holidayed over there, and meeting the Consumer Council in Fiji, you kind of hear, well, same with the Caribbean. They just get all the rubbish, all the things that don't meet standards, international standards, just gets dumped elsewhere at a place that they can't have, well, they don't have infrastructure to manage. So how do we harmonise and work together? And that may deem some compromise, but also have credibility and transparency, but keep raising capability. And I think that's really key, because otherwise some of those manufacturing countries are just going to get blown out of the water and they won't be able to meet those standards. So how do we also look at it from a global economic and equity perspective? So it is very challenging, but I agree, harmonisation for manufacturing and having clarity of a one-stop shop is really important.
I also like that you mentioned the integration. I think that's a very important element. I think it's to have an all-consuming eco-label would be of much more benefit. And I think that's the way, in the future, I see that coming. Can I just make one little couple of comments about the general discussions today on repairability? I was very interested to hear and keen that the automotive repair legislation and the discussion on medical instruments both referred to a focus on professional repairers. That is something that came up in the Eco Design Directive, that the focus was on professional repairers, people who were trained, knew the standards, regulations, and had insurance cover.
Thank you, Ian. I think that's a very good point. Thank you very much. John, I have no further questions via Slido.
Sure. Look, I think one of the other things that strikes me is, you know, we learn from the world, we learn from other jurisdictions, but there's some amazing work here that's happened in Australia at different levels. You know, repairability, as we've heard over the last day and a half, is a very rich space in terms of what it means to different interested parties. You've got amazing work happening with Monash and the Sustainable Development Institute there, and they've done some comprehensive work around circularity and eco-labels, the work of Jenny Downs and Stefan Kaufman, and they've really, you know, some of their findings, and Kate, you might be familiar with this, but you know, characteristics of an overall scheme tend to matter more than just the label itself. That regulation is often required to underpin it, provide a safety net, include industry-wide participation, and that government eco-labels, from their own findings, are more trusted than sometimes independent or NGO labels. Also, great work by the UTS Design School, Jesse Adams-Stein, Tom Lee and co. So there's a lot of really good heavy lifting in terms of the issues, the discovery process around what makes a good label, how that can drive better design, because this is not just about a label on products, it is how can we use labels as well to drive improved product development so that it is meaningful, it's measurable, and there is impact. It's not just speaking to the converted tribes. So I think that's important. I think we're done. I'd just like to close off by thanking the panellists very, very much, and the questions from the floor, and also to acknowledge the Productivity Commission. There are a couple of staff here who are, and I know Sophie at least was deeply involved with the research work and the hearings on the right to repair inquiry and the report, and I think the recommendations there are a really tangible starting point in terms of progressing labelling and what can be done and how it could be done, and making sure that that process is inclusive. And also great that, you know, there are some industries that are more enthusiastic than others. The fact that you're here today, whether we agree with everything or not, Ian, that you're here on behalf of your members is important, and not hearing all of that resistance sometimes you do hear from certain peak bodies, which I must say personally is very disappointing. But anyway, that's another debate. So thanks very much to the panel, and join me in thanking them.